Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a special BRAP. By the way, I just a quick programming note here. We will have our regular scheduled BRAP at 9 p.m. Eastern time tonight. So come back, hang out with us in about 9 hours or so. And but we're doing this 12 p.m. BRAP because we have with us the executive co-producer at Last Stand Media and co-host at or I should say with Sacred Symbols podcast. We have returning guest Dustin Furman. Dustin, welcome back to BRAP, sir.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me. I just right before we started, my wife walked in with a latte. Oh. And so I'm good to go. Second coffee, ready to talk some games. So yeah, thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, it's before we went live, we were chatting how we had you on 3 years ago, and I mean, time flies, right? I just can't believe it's been 3 years, and so much has changed in the last 3 years with the video game industry. Yeah, you know, there's just we see it every day, right? With the news, we see what's happened with the Embracer Group. We see consolidation in the industry, even more consolidation. I mean, the massive acquisition of ABK. There's just so much that's happened in the last 3 years that I want to talk about with you and kind of get your thoughts. But before I do that, I want to just welcome everyone to live chat. Thank you for joining us live. Really appreciate the support as always. Do me a quick favor. I'm going to drop a link here in the live chat and share it on X or Twitter, whatever you call it these days, or your favorite social media platform. Let everyone know we're live. Let everyone know that we have Dustin on as a special guest. It looks like you have some fans here in the live chat as well. Dustin, Otacon Oslet says, Dustin in the house. So thank you, Otacon. You are regular here, so thank you again. And, oh, hey, Priscilla, great to see you here as well. But so Dustin, so I do want to start the show off, kind of give everyone kind of just a quick history of your gaming experience. I know we discussed this 3 years ago, but for those who aren't familiar with a little bit of your background, your work at Last Stand Media, Sacred Symbols, and also your gaming history, like when you started gaming, if you can give everyone just a quick background there.
Yeah, so that's one other thing we were talking about beforehand about, you know, how long we've been gaming, and you mentioned remembering the crash. Not quite that far back, but I basically have been playing my whole life, starting with, I think the first console I played was Sega Genesis, and after that, like I got an NES later, which is kind of, you know, reverse, but you know, that's just kind of how it turned out with like my parents. They knew I liked video games. They were able to hide the fact from me that, you know, we weren't super well off. So like Christmas that one year was an NES and a giant stack of games, and that was super cool. But really, the main thing growing up for me was PlayStation. PlayStation 1 and 2 were both huge consoles in my life, and really was the groundwork for how much that console being a part of who I am professionally now. I did take some time away from PlayStation, as many people did at the beginning of the PS3 era, simply just because, Halo was huge amongst my friend base. The Xbox 360, clearly at the beginning of the generation was the better console in a lot of ways. And I also just simply couldn't afford a PS3, even if I wanted one. So I kind of left PlayStation for Xbox for a bit, and then returned like many people did for PlayStation 4. And yeah, so as far as my like professional stuff, as you said, I work for Last Stand Media. I'm the executive producer there, and I'm the co-host of Sacred Symbols, and also the host of Punching Up, a Nintendo podcast. And it's a funny, very long-winded story that I've said a few different times. So I'll keep it brief here, but just like getting inspired of getting into podcasting from listening to people like Colin with Podcast Beyond many years ago, and then hustling, making podcasts that very few people listen to for many years, and then kind of being at the right place at the right time, getting to meet Colin. And being able to do a little bit of work for him on the side as far as editing. And then Colin and I kind of struck it off professionally and personally as well, just being able to figure out that we had a great working relationship together. And eventually made me executive producer. And then the crazy part was him putting me on Sacred Symbols, which is something I never expected to happen. And so now what's crazy, you talked about being, 3 years ago since you and I last did this show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It probably would have been around the time that I started on Sacred Symbols as an official co-host, because it was episode 150 that he officially added me. Mm-hmm. And now we just passed episode 300. So there are more episodes with me on it than not. So it's weird, because in some ways I still feel like the new guy on the show, but now I'm officially over the hump of most episodes have me on it. So that's the brief summary, I think. But it's been a crazy ride so far.
Yeah, and I got to say, I really love the growth that Last Stand Media has had over the last couple of years. You mentioned punching up. We actually had Gene Park on. I think it was January of this year. Yeah, Gene was a great guest, and Gene's really nice, by the way. We both live in the same metropolitan area, and he's like, "Hey, if you ever come down to the city, let's meet up for lunch." Well, that'd be awesome. I gotta take Gene up on that offer, because I think, like I said, we had him on. He was a great guest. But that show, Defining Duke, Sacred Symbols, those are really my go-to shows when I listen to content, because I love the chemistry with the three different shows, and I love the conversation. I feel like a lot of the times, many times, that the conversation around video games is like, hey, I'm not going to use profanity here, but it's very poo-poo-ish.
Yeah, sure.
Like there's a lot of missing nuance and context to the conversation. Like when we discuss things like industry trends, people leave out a lot of nuance and don't really kind of get into the meat and potatoes of things. Or I often find that people really aren't students of the industry, but yet they're having conversations around very complex business issues with the video game industry, because the video game industry it's not an easy industry. High risk, high reward. I mean, we talked about your history just a second ago. You started playing on the PlayStation or Sega Genesis. Sega's not making consoles anymore.
Yeah,
they're gone. Like Dustin, if someone would have said to you when you had your Genesis, hey, Dustin, when did the Genesis come out? Like 91, 92? I don't remember now.
Yeah, I think,
earlier than that.
I think it depends on Japan versus US. I want to say US may have been early 90s, we'll say.
Early 90s, yeah, we'll say early. So if I would have said to you, hey, Dustin, Sega's not going to be around in 10 years, you probably would have been like, what? Like, that's crazy.
Yeah.
But
the risk is so high now, and that's the kind of the unfortunate thing is I guess it's a double-edged sword. You think about all these different consoles we had, some of them amazing, a lot of them absolutely terrible. And so, it's kind of nice for the consumer that's been narrowed down, that the three options are there and reliable. But there aren't many newcomers now into the field. And so, like, the loss of a Sega, sure, that was, when the Dreamcast came out, that's been a long time. But it's like, now with PlayStation and Xbox, obviously the features and the different subscriptions and stuff like that make them very different. But in terms of hardware, they're kind of the same thing for the most part. It's kind of boring,
Yeah, they really are the same thing. And they're very similar. They're both based on x86 architecture. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just, I feel like there was more hardware differentiators in the past, maybe, like the way they were architected.
Right.
But like you said, they're very similar. It's all, based off of, x86 architecture. But I think, like, I use the Sega examples just to speak to the volatility of the industry. And we'll get to this in a little bit, but I think that's the part where we talk about consoles dying, which I feel like's kind of been a conversation for well over a decade now. The people forget that it's a high risk, high reward industry. It's not easy to make games. And even if you make a great, creative, critically acclaimed game, that doesn't guarantee success anymore.
Right.
So I just feel like people forget the complexities and the dynamics, the market dynamics of the gaming industry, and how could and the fact that and we'll talk about this later. There's a finite consumer base that want to play video games, and that's no different from other consumer products. Like if you look at take the Air Jordan brand. There's only finite consumers that want Air Jordans. That's just the nature of the beast.
And it's especially crazy right now. You mentioned that the industry, the games industry, is hard to talk about because a lot of industries are very complicated. But
yeah.
I feel like gaming right now is especially difficult, and it's important for me, at least on Sacred Symbols, to know when to like back off and know when you don't necessarily know what you're talking about, or at least make it very clear that you're like, okay, this is kind of what I'm thinking, but it's so tough, and especially right now, there's the conversation around like what's going on with the industry, all the layoffs, consoles, Xbox seemingly changing what the idea of what a console even is, stuff like that. So there's all of these elements in combination with the fact that COVID and what happened as far as the influx of cash into the industry completely changed everything. And to the point where like we saw all this money coming in, there's all this investment in gaming, and then it turns out it's like, it's not that gaming is necessarily dying. There was this false projection of what gaming was going to be post-COVID, and now we're just kind of, there's the inhale, and now we're kind of on the exhale. And
that's a great point.
The industry is feeling the effects of like, hey, maybe we shouldn't have gone as crazy as we did.
Yeah, that's a great point, and we'll talk a little bit more about that on the show here in a bit. But I do want to talk about video games right now, like current video games that you're playing, and what are some of your most anticipated video games of 2024?
Yeah, so what I'm playing right now, I'm in I don't know if it's a weird spot, but just this happens every few months, a few times a year, where you're kind of in between big releases, so you're just kind of filling the cracks with random stuff. So my last big game, of course, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, amazing game, loved it, and so now I'm kind of just waiting. Where today is Wednesday, April 24th, and this Friday, Stellar Blade comes out. The reviews just dropped, just within the last 2 hours, and so I'm very excited to play that. But in between Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Stellar Blade, like I said, I've been just checking out and going back to some old games. So I would say the three main games I've been playing on this in between are Balatro, the poker roguelike game, which has been amazing. I've been playing Chrono Trigger on the Steam Deck just because that was one of the main like gaming sim games that I had never played before, and so I'm having a good time with that. And then just in the last 2 days, this is new. This is a BRAP exclusive because I haven't talked about this on a show yet, is that I've been getting really into or back into Roller Coaster Tycoon. And really? I don't know if you know about this game.
Yeah,
this game is amazing. This is one of those games I played the original when it came out in the early 2000s, played Roller Coaster Tycoon 2, and I just go back to it every few years. And what's pretty amazing now is that there's a mod for it called Open RCT, which goes and does all these quality of life improvement, makes it work way better on modern computers. And so I've been diving into that since it's been a few years. And I am just so fascinated by the timelessness of the game. The way that, you have a game, the sequel, Roller Coaster Tycoon 3, which was from one of the early games from Frontier that did Planet Coaster. And it doesn't hold up anywhere near as well, despite having, newer 3D graphics and stuff like that. There's something about the more pixel art isometric view that just holds up. And it's funny because I started playing it yesterday and probably played for 2 hours or something. And my wife Holly also grew up with it. And so I was playing, and last night she came up to me and just presented to me her laptop, and she's like, "Can you please get this running for me on my laptop?" I was like, "Yeah, no problem."
That's awesome.
So we were both simultaneously, not together, but we were both playing Roller Coaster Tycoon last night, and it's just an amazing game. It just celebrated 25 years. They were just doing a big celebration for that.
Wow.
So shout out to that game. I'm having a blast.
Yeah, I remember playing, that was like one of the sim games that I played like 20 something years ago. And I played that, and I was really into SimCity 2000.
Oh yeah. Nice, dude. Yeah. I played more of 3000, but that was also an awesome game.
Yeah, and I just remember like I would spend hours, like literally hours, playing SimCity 2000. Age of Empires was another one that I would play quite a bit. But yeah, I mean, like SimCity 2000, Roller Coaster Tycoon. What's the other one that you just mentioned? Roller Coaster.
Planet Coaster is a lot newer.
Yeah.
So yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So my 14-year-old plays Planet Coaster a lot on PC. And I never toyed around with it, but he'll play that game for hours too, and like build like the theme park and like do all like the concessions and make sure make sure the customers are happy. It's it reminds me of SimCity back in the days where you had to, if you raised taxes too high, the people would complain. But those games are. I don't play sim games as much as I used to because they're like they're time sinks for me. Like I will just spend hours. Yeah. The last Age of Empires that came out, I wanted to try because it was part of Game Pass, and I literally spent like 4 hours. And before I knew it, I looked up. I was like, I couldn't believe I spent that much time playing it.
That's what happened to me last night. I was playing Roller Coaster Tycoon, as I was saying, and it was 11 o'clock. And I always want to watch One Piece every night before I go to bed. Like that's like I'm like I have to watch One Piece. We're trying to get through all 1,100 some episodes or whatever. And so I was like, okay, well, I know Holly will want to go to bed around midnight, so I'm gonna play for another 10 minutes, and then I'm gonna go down. And then when I looked at the clock again, it was like 11:40, and I was like, dang, what happened? That 40 minutes went by so quickly, but. Every once in a while, you need a time sync game like that. Yeah. It's like that's what I've always said about Call of Duty. I love playing Call of Duty games, but I hit a limit with them where eventually I feel like I know all video games are like quote unquote a waste of time, but I hit a point with Call of Duty where I'm like, man, I could have put this much time to another game. I'm kind of just like doing this endless dopamine loop. Like I gotta switch it up. Eventually, like I said, I will definitely play Call of Duty again, but I understand that feeling of like, oh, this endless loop, you got to break out of it.
Did you play Baldur's Gate 3 by any chance?
Yes. I feel really bad because I didn't finish that game. I played Act 1 and 2 and started Act 3, and then it got away from me. And I felt especially bad because I was like, I'm pretty sure this is my game of the year. And so it's like a really weird situation. I'm like, I said it was game of the year, and then I never found a chance to get back to it. But amazing game.
Yeah, I probably logged about almost 400 hours.
Yeah, man, I believe it.
Yeah, and actually I beat it like 3 times on PC, and then I'm close to beating it on PlayStation 5 now. But I we talk about time sinks. Like I had to say, you know what, I can't do this anymore because I'm missing out on so many great games, and I had to stop. But that's just one of those games. There, like for me, like if I think about like the years I've been gaming, there's very few games that really stand out for me. Like like I always feel like there's certain games that will stand out for me each generation. You mentioned Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and then you mentioned PlayStation 1 earlier. Like Final Fantasy VII stands out to me on the original PlayStation.
Right.
It was such like a monumental moment in gaming for me. Just like, here we are, new technology, the musical score. I mean, like it was just like, wow, almost cinematic like experience. Well, at that time it was cinematic. Metal Gear Solid would be another one, that console generation, that stood out to me. And there's some others, but for me, Baldur's Gate 3 really has, I mean, it's one of those games I look back at. It's one of the best games that I've played. The unique characters, the great writing, just how the choices actually have real impact to the story. It's just one of those games. Like every time I played it, Dustin, like I would have or experience a new dialogue tree or a new outcome. And I was just like, wow. And I thought to myself, like, geez, like, well, if I do this character now, this particular character build, I can go back and have a different experience. And that's kind of the draw, the appeal to me. Plus, I grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons, so there's that. But
right,
yeah, but that was my game of the year last for 2023. So
yeah, the thing that kept happening to me with that game that just blew my mind was there was so many times where you think, I wonder if I can do that. And then the game's like, oh, yeah, you can. And no, it's not perfect. There are certain things I tried to do. It's like, okay, well, that's not going to work. But the one thing that blew my mind completely, and I guess you could say is, I'll be extremely vague because it's not story related. It's a situation where I was in the goblin camp and there's a boss there on his like throne thing. And I couldn't figure out how to beat him. And I was like, what if I just put a bunch of explosives around him and then went up in the rafters and then shot a fireball at him? And it totally worked. Like, he just got totally blown up and died. And I was like, oh, well, I feel like it feels like I cheesed the game kind of, but I also would have never, like, that's just, yeah, that makes sense that I would have been able to do that. So the game, the open-endedness of the game, which I guess also to say was kind of part of the reason why I fell out of it. Which this is no fault of the game. This is fault of me being not necessarily smart enough in certain situations. Act 3 opens up so much that I completely found it overwhelming, where it's like the first two acts are feel like tutorials compared to Act 3 in my mind. Absolutely. Where it's like, man, there are so many directions to go in. You can get lost in figuring out what to do. But I'm going to get back to it at some point. We'll see. You and I were talking about me having a kid in a few months, so maybe that's wishful thinking at some point with a baby coming, but we'll see.
Yeah. No, you're right with Act 3. It opens up a lot, and like you're right, like Act 1 and 2 are kind of like tutorials that prepare you for what you need to do in Act 3. But the scenario you described at the Goblin Camp where you set up the explosive barrels,
yeah,
that's what I love. There are different ways to approach combat situations or scenarios with that game. You can be very strategic about it, or you can just like run into the fight. But and also depending on what characters you take with you, that's going to kind of impact the kind of strategy that you apply to whatever combat scenario you're in at the time. So. Just a great overall game. I'll get back to it eventually and beat it on PlayStation 5, but it just, for me, it's just one of those gems that I'm going to remember as probably one of the best games that I played this generation. So, yeah,
and it's such a feel-good story for Larian too.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the game they wanted to make for years. They finally had the chance. It comes out and it totally redefines people's expectations of an entire genre, and took people like me who said I don't like the CRPG style and made me a fan of it. I mean, I don't think there's any greater compliment. And now they're going and said they're not making Baldur's Gate 4 and they're doing their own thing. I think that's awesome, because imagine how much money they had to give to Wizards of the Coast to be able to use that IP. And now they have so much name recognition. The next game they're going to come out, they could say the sequel to, or from the creators of Baldur's Gate 3, and they'll be able to own the IP. I mean, that's awesome. It's only up as far as I can tell for them.
Yeah. No, and they've even before Baldur's Gate 3, they have, was it Divinity Original Sins was the other, and those are very popular amongst PC players. I don't know how those games did commercially, but they were, I mean, those are games where highly acclaimed, like I think I want to say the like Metacritic's like in the 90s for those games, maybe low 90s, high 80s. But those were good games. And so they already had that foundation, that template for creating this kind of game off the Divinity series with Baldur's Gate 3. And so I don't disagree with you. I'm excited to see what they're going to do with a new IP. Because the talent, the foundation's been there. It's there. Right. And, I think this, for me, at least in my opinion, I think what Baldur's Gate 3 did was really put, people know of Larian, but I think more people know of them now because of Baldur's Gate 3. And so there'll be more eyes I think there'll be more eyes on their next game, and I think that's a positive for them. Yeah,
I'd love to see them do something. I mean, I think that there will be an element of fantasy, whatever they do, but I'd love to see them do like a sci-fi fantasy game or something in a, or you could do like a cyber, well, maybe not cyberpunk. They don't want to be too close to actual cyberpunk, but I'm just saying outside of like wizards and goblins and stuff like that, take it somewhere totally new, because they've really kind of made the ultimate game in that type of world. So I'm very excited to see what they do next.
Yeah, likewise. So earlier in the show, we mentioned it's been 3 years since we last had you on. A lot of stuff has changed in the video game industry, and I want to discuss Xbox here because so I've been in the Xbox ecosystem since like day one of the original Xbox, and then was an Xbox Live beta tester, and like you left PlayStation for a bit to go to Xbox. Well, I didn't completely PlayStation, but primarily like the Xbox was my console choice for like 3 generations. Well, 2.5. I'll say 2.5 because I went back to the PlayStation 4 and then towards the middle part of last generation, and that became my primary gaming platform, console gaming platform. But they've changed a lot over the last 20 years, and even the last 10 years, even the last 4 years since the release of the consoles. They have had this massive pivot now, and I feel like they're kind of in this like strange place. And I'm not saying because I know the console warriors are going to be like, you're just hating on Xbox. No, I'm not saying what they're doing is good or bad. I'm not saying that. I'm more curious to see how this new strategy is going to play out. Are they going to release even more first-party games on PlayStation and Nintendo? I personally think, in my opinion, I think that's a possibility. One of the things that I've seen with Phil Spencer releases, when he says something, he often goes back on what he said and then does something different. But I also think they've been telegraphing this for quite some time. If you listen to their CFO this past last summer, I think it was the Xbox CFO, I forget his name now, who talked about their strategy and putting more of their games on rival platforms. And that's happening now, but it's kind of a weird place. Where do you think the console platform sits, or how important do you think that is to Xbox now? And what do you think of the potential pivot here and them trying to, lack of a better word, they're really trying to obviously disrupt the industry, kind of tear down that traditional walled garden model that Nintendo and PlayStation have been very successful at. So what are your thoughts about them over the last couple of years?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny you were mentioning about how they've changed progressively. I feel like even in the last year in particular, last 6 months, we've seen a huge shift. I mean, particularly right now, the big conversation, of course, is about them releasing games on PlayStation and Nintendo Switch. And it's weird. It's a mix of surprising and not surprising in a lot of ways, in that I feel like it's surprising from the perspective of seeing like the Xbox leadership camp and how much they've believed in hardware, believed in the Xbox platform. But from the Microsoft perspective, it's not really that surprising in just how much of a service-focused company they are and how much of a software company they are. And so I wonder what happened, or maybe nothing did happen and this was kind of part of the plan, which seems odd. Is just that somewhere along the line it became more that Xbox became more interested in being one of the world's biggest video game publishers over being the de facto, like trying to dominate the console space completely. And so now we're seeing, the 4 games, and man, I know that, you mentioned listening to Sacred Symbols, so you've heard this, and maybe some of the live listeners have, but like seeing Phil Spencer communicate sometimes, I'm like, man, what do you what are you doing here? Just because it was funny seeing how that all went down, just because there was the leaks, and there was like, oh, Starfield's part of it, and then Starfield's not part of it, and then they did that the business podcast, the business update, I think it was called, and we talked about on Sacred how like some of the language, like very particular, like, oh, it's just 4 games. We're doing just 4 games.
Yeah.
And then I can't remember her name, but the woman that was doing the interview was like, is Starfield one of them? And Phil said no. And it's like, okay, well, no, Starfield is not one of those 4, but surely it's on the table in the future. And I would imagine that would be the case, especially with Bethesda, who and a lot of people don't remember this or choose not to remember, is that there was those interviews with Todd Howard where he's like, yeah, I can't imagine that it will be only on Xbox I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but the point is that there was clearly some like hesitancy, and we saw that in some of the leaked documents from the ABK deal that came out when there was all the court cases, that Bethesda wasn't necessarily happy about being just exclusive to Xbox. So we're seeing this big shift, and also there's this whole element where it's like, okay, they went and spent so much money acquiring developers, acquiring publishers, and now I imagine that Microsoft leadership's like, okay, so we need to see some return on this, and we're not getting that return just from Game Pass and releasing some of these games on just Xbox. And we still see remnants of like other big question marks. Like obviously there's no strong rumor or leak about Starfield specifically, but in the case of the Blade game, Blade has no confirmed platforms. Other than it just says Xbox, but it doesn't say exclusive, and that's something we talked about extensively. On Sacred Symbols. It's like, okay, well, why are you being weird about that? Like, no, and no one's willing to ask them. Like when people have interviewed Phil, no one asks about that directly, and so clearly a shift is happening, and the big question is how's it going to pay off? And the number one thing that I'm just worried about is that I don't think Xbox hardware is going away, but we don't need Sony to be any more cocky than they already are, because that's what,
by the way, thank you for that.
Yeah. I agree. That's what sucks is that, we see Sony becoming less aggressive in a lot of ways, and they have the market dominance, and, I don't know. I guess that manifests in different ways. Some people view them good or bad. Like this year is at this point is going to go by without a first party release from PlayStation, and obviously that's upsetting to a lot of hardcore PlayStation fans. I've kind of been on the side that they've been really smart about their second party and third party partnerships, and taking the time to highlight those and give those time to shine, and let their big sellers cook a little bit. So yeah, and it will be interesting to see like what a big question we talked about for Xbox is like, what will be Game 5, because Sea of Thieves is going to be out pretty soon on PlayStation 5, and is going to see already was like one of the top pre-sold games at one point on the PlayStation Store, and I think Grounded's not out yet. Right, but that's also coming, and so I would imagine that Game 5 has already been decided, and the question just is what is it, and how do people react at that point? Just because I think as annoying as the messaging kind of has been, as far as being a little flip-floppy and in the middle on certain things, I kind of get it that they needed to let people down, not let people down, but let them understand gently. Start with a few games, say it's just these 4 for now, but I really think the plan all along is that there will be a stronger drip feed of these games.
I don't disagree. Christopher Dring of GameIndustry.biz had mentioned he had heard, and I don't know if this was specifically at GDC because he had reported some other things that he had heard coming out of GDC. But he mentioned, he goes, what I'm hearing, there's that more majority of their games are going to be coming to other platforms, and that's telling. I think, again, I take some of these things sometimes with a grain of salt because nothing's been officially corroborated just yet. But I think if Chris is hearing that, Chris doesn't strike me as someone that would just make something up or that would speak on something he's not confident or hasn't had direct knowledge of, or someone's communicate that to him. But I think that's the case. I think it was just 4, but there's definitely more. And you mentioned Starfield. There was a follow-up interview. I don't know if you read this interview with Tom Warren, like right after the business event, which is again, like what the other thing with the business event, you guys, like you mentioned on Sacred Symbols, you guys talk about like Phil Spencer, how he kind of talks too much. Like, right. None of the other big 2 or the big 3, like Nintendo nor PlayStation, have business events like this. And that was a kind of a scenario where I feel like, why do you always have to talk about what you're doing? Just do it. Right. The market's going to decide. The market's going to react to whatever your strategy is. And I feel like sometimes when they talk too much. Like sometimes less is more. And I feel like they just I feel like watching that and I don't know if you felt this way, but watching that show, that business event, it actually left me with more answers, or I'm sorry, left me with more questions than it did answers. Right.
There's a great video from one of my favorite games commentators, Kyle Bossman. He has a show called Delayed Input that I don't remember specifically.
Kyle is great. That show was great, by the way. I love it. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, he's amazing. He's one of my all-time favorites just because he has ideas and presents them in such unique and thought-provoking ways. And one of his things that he did when he did a video after that business update was talking about how the way Phil Spencer came off in that video was, or just, actually, no, it wasn't the business update. It was when he was on Kind of Funny Games talking about after Redfall came out, that he comes off as someone who like reads the comments too much. And that's like very unexecutive like. And so for him as an executive,
I'm sorry, Dustin, they care too much about what people on social media say. They've been like that since the launch of the Xbox One. It's like, guys, like we don't see Nintendo and Sony. Like I don't see them like dialed into what Twitter's saying.
Right. Yeah. And that's the thing, is that not just him, but kind of the Xbox brand, they've kind of walked this fine line of being very close to their audience. Phil, the one thing, especially during the Jim Ryan era, that it was like so funny to make these comparisons about Jim Ryan, who clearly doesn't really play games. And that's, you can make an argument whether or not that's good or bad. He, very business focused. And then there's Phil, who's, on playing Fallout 76 or playing all these different games all the time. So like very tuned in with the audience, but also the Xbox brand in general being much closer with its influencers and stuff like that. And so that's kind of the issue they ran into, where it's like you live by the sword and you die by the sword in that situation, where you let them in and kind of, give them all these not perks or whatever, but like really focus in and lean on the audience. And then when the audience isn't happy, there's this need to like, oh, we gotta respond. We gotta say this, we gotta do that. And it's like, what is that fine line for Phil to be, the executive that's close to the audience? And when does he need to put on his executive hat? And when is he the gamer alongside everyone else? And so that's something that I think that he's kind of struggled with, at least in my opinion.
I don't disagree with you. We've actually talked about that on this show quite a bit. Like Phil the Gamer, when Phil the Gamer speaks, he has these very noble ideas about gaming. Like I don't have an issue with that. But then the Phil that we got to do better managing our production pipeline. We can make an 11 out of 10 game. It wouldn't matter. I'm like, Phil, like, don't say that. Like, don't say, even if that's what's happening behind the scenes. Like, we all know, like those who are really following the industry, we know you're behind. We know you're behind the competition. Like, We know that. But
Right.
I didn't feel like he needed to double down on that message. Like, we know that.
I think that interview he did with Kind of Funny Games is one of the most like wild things that has ever, maybe not one of the most wild things that's ever happened, but just to see him not only sandbag the latest release that they just put out, which it's like, yeah, I appreciate the honesty from him, but at the same time, it's like, bro, you're in charge, and you might not. You may be being a little bit too honest in some ways. It's like, yeah, you might not want to say that, but also at that point, being like, yeah, I'm trying to remember exactly what he said, where basically it was like, yeah, everyone already has their digital libraries on PlayStation, and we're never gonna out console Sony. It's like, ooh, like that's not a promising mindset, I would say.
That doesn't speak to me as an executive. That doesn't speak confidence to the brand, to your brand. If you're an executive and you're saying that, like, what's the message you're conveying to consumers? Hey, like, we don't. To me, that just seems like, look, we tried these things. They're not working. We're not going to on-console them. You know, it just sounds like almost like defeatist in a way.
Right. Well, and now you see the shift in strategy, where it's like, okay, well, if Phil said that, we're not going to out-console them, and now these games are coming over to both platforms, and I think that's kind of like a he said this, and now here we're seeing the action afterwards. So I don't want to make it sound like Xbox all bad, because there's many things. Like right now they have that initiative about game preservation and stuff like that, and I think that's awesome. That's one area where I'm like, man, Sony, you're barely doing the minimum here with keeping your old games alive as far as PlayStation 1, 2, and 3 and stuff like that. Like, yeah, the classics on PlayStation Premium have been cool, but as far as what Xbox is able to do, where you're able to put in an original Xbox game into your Series X and it plays at 4K in some cases, that's amazing. So I appreciate them, and I want them to do well and to continue in the console business, because like I said, we don't need Sony to be any more cocky than they already are.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you, Dustin. Like, I have concerns about, like, I know a lot of people laughed at the notion when the FTC suggested that there's a high-end console market. I believe there is. I mean, like, if you look at the price points, the specs, the different specs between the Xbox Series X, PlayStation 5 versus, like the Nintendo Switch, they're clearly different products, and we see this with other consumer products too, where you have different product tiers. And I believe that that's the case in the console business, in the console market. And I don't want to see Sony as being the only high-end console manufacturer, because what's the incentive for them to really push out great products? I mean, this goes down to this basic fundamental of why competition is good for the market, because it drives innovation. It drives, what's the word I'm looking for? Innovation, creativity. It also drives quality, because when you're competing, and we saw this at the end of the PlayStation 3 generation, all those great IPs that we love today were born out of like Sony. Like, look, we got to get our shit together.
Right.
We're being outsold. We had a terrible launch. We had a terrible message at launch. Get a second job. Like, really? Like, that's what you guys are. That's how you're selling me your PlayStation 3. So I don't want Sony by themselves, because I want Sony to be pushed. I don't want Sony to become complacent, and where we see longer gaps in in IP from them, from first party, or maybe they feel like, oh, we don't have to spend as much, or we don't have to, that sense of quality maybe doesn't have to be there. We don't have to be as because we know, just hearing behind the scenes, that Sony doesn't like compromising quality. But I don't want that to happen, and that's a concern of mine.
Right.
If they're left to compete by themselves, how does that impact consumers? And again, less suppliers in the market, that doesn't necessarily benefit consumers, which is why I was very vocal against the ABK merger, because again, it's consolidation in the industry, so which leads to less suppliers in the market. Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking, I mean, it's interesting to just we've been talking about how Xbox has changed and going more multi-platform, and it's interesting because we are seeing some of that from Sony too, particularly in the PC space where they're releasing more of their games on PC. We just got news last week about them tying trophies on PC, and ultimately, I'm thinking that they will eventually do certain games day and date on PC. Which the hilarious thing about this, as far as talking about competition, Valve has the opportunity to do the funniest thing if they were to get into having some kind of Steam Deck like console or something like that, where it's like, hey, if PlayStation's releasing games on PC, if Xbox is releasing games on PC, what if we were able to, through the Steam platform, provide you both? And this is something that is deeply fascinating to me, just because Valve originally tried to do consoles, but they weren't quite ready yet in terms of like it being a Linux only console. The games had to be ported, Steam Machine, yeah, and it didn't work out. No. But now when I look at Steam Deck and the amazing work they've been able to do with Proton and stuff like that, I think, man, they really could give this another shot and make something that's more powerful than Steam Deck, designed to be plugged in, have access to your Steam library, and be able to play both, have cross save with Steam Deck. It really could be interesting. And so as far as like talking about new competition, I mean, man, I feel like Valve, it would be in a really interesting choice. Unfortunately, not as interesting as far as like a creativity point, as far as like they don't really make games anymore, which is a little disappointing because their games are awesome. But as far as a competition aspect, I mean, it would definitely have me questioning certain things. That's like, man, this thing has everything. It works. The cross saves with my main PC and Steam Deck, like that would be pretty neat.
Yeah. Yeah. The interesting thing, as we talk about kind of the evolution of the console space, like you're starting to see more crossover, right? You're starting to see, cross save, cross progression, excuse me, cross play. And then you're starting to see, I mean, obviously Microsoft's really been more on the pedal with this than PlayStation, with putting their games day and date on PC. But you're starting to see Sony dip their toes in the PC space. Helldivers 2 has been obviously a success for them. It continues doing well, and you brought up day and date for PlayStation first party. That's been a conversation now. Is this the direction that Sony's eventually going to go? I've kind of been on the other side of the fence where I'm like, I don't think they will, but hey, you never say never. I think if they feel like, hey, we can make money and there isn't a potential cannibalization impact to our core console business, then I think they would do it. But it's interesting. I've heard different opinions on this from people in the industry. I've talked to former PlayStation employees who are like, no, they're not going to do it because the math isn't mathing right now. They would need to sell even more games on the console to make up for the lost revenue of being someone, because obviously when someone's in the PlayStation ecosystem, and I always use this analogy, Dustin. I'm like, think of the PlayStation console as like a Costco. You walk in, everything you buy in there, Costco gets a piece of, right? And if you're buying their first party, like Costco, I forget what their brand is. Is it
Kirkland?
Yeah, Kirkland. Thank you. Which I buy when I go to Costco. If you buy the Kirkland stuff, that's their first party, and they get 100% of that. So what I've heard is if it will make sense if there's enough revenue to offset people buying inside, that walled garden, that platform of the PlayStation 5, because they get a cut of all that, and
right.
It's selling one title on PC day and date where they have to share the revenue with Steam or Epic, or that's why there's rumors of them working on their own launcher. Does it make sense? And so I think to me that's going to be curious to see like how that math works out for them, and if that's something that they eventually do. I don't think they will, but again, I'm not saying they never will. You just never know, right? If
Right.
companies like making money, if they feel like they can make money doing that, they will do it.
Yeah, the launcher is an interesting thought, and this is something we just talked about last week on Sacred. And I was saying that if they did want to do their own launcher, they need to provide incentives to the purchaser in order to do it not on Steam. And so, you mentioned cross progression, but I brought up, like, what if it's cross buy, where if you buy a game on the PlayStation Store, whether it's on PlayStation 5 or it's on PC, specifically their first and second party games, what if you buy it and you get the PC version included, and so you can get it on the launcher, or if you buy it on the launcher, you get the PS5 version. So PCs are interesting in that there are some people that are only going to be PC players forever and ever. They're not interested in a console experience, and I get that. And in some ways, I relate to that because I am a huge snob for frame rates and resolutions, and so if a game's better on PC, that's where I'm going to play it. But I think that there are a lot of people, and this is where I'm also in this camp, is that my PC is up here in my office, and I don't always want to play games in here. Sometimes I've been podcasting all day or doing different work, and I don't want to sit at this desk anymore. So I want that console experience as well, and I'm willing to take that trade-off. And so if Sony did look at that and be like, okay, well, we can kind of get people in both spots, that makes some sense to me.
Yeah. Let me get this super chat real quick before I forget. My apologies, Street Shadow, with the $5 super chat. Thank you for that super chat. I appreciate it. Says, I think Xbox under Microsoft is trying to make Xbox into the Microsoft Office of gaming. Get it everywhere, but get the better experience on Windows native products. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I mean, that kind of, I think, speaks to that model of software as a service. Get it everywhere. I don't think they're going to abandon the console anytime soon, Dustin. But I in my opinion, I do think the console numbers I think those days are numbered.
Right. Well, what do you think about, there was, during the business update, Sarah Bond, I believe, was saying that their next hardware, they're in development, and it's going to be, I want to make sure I don't misquote, was it the biggest technological leap for consoles?
Yeah.
Really interesting thing to say.
It is interesting, but when she said that, I kind of cringed a little bit, like, let's not do that, Microsoft, because you remember when they released the Xbox One X and all the talk around the power of that particular platform, and I felt like they never really took advantage of the hardware per se with the Xbox One X. And then we get the Xbox Series X, which, look, it is I'm never going to downplay the capabilities of that console and how powerful it is. But they said it eats monsters for breakfast. And so then they talked about its power and this and that, and the teraflops. But again, it's a situation where they never really, I think, in my opinion, tapped into the hardware of the Xbox Series X. And so when she said that, I was like, I just, based on their track record, I'm like, I'm going to wait and see what that means.
Right.
But it is kind of interesting. Like, it's a little thought provoking, right? Like, okay, well, what do you mean? Like, what does that mean? But again, like, I just looking back at Xbox and their word tracks for other hardware releases, I'm not on the up and up with it or about it. So we'll see,
Yeah, it is tough. I like thinking back, and I don't want to be the guy that's like, they said and did this 10 years ago, and look how it worked out, and that's how we need to view things now. So I don't want to sound completely like that, but I think about with Xbox One and the big thing about the power of the cloud, how the power of the console can be expanded through the cloud, and then seeing how that actually played out, not really being all that promising. And so when I think about what the biggest technological leap would be, which, first of all, for a console, it's like, man, like, are you making the argument this is going to be a bigger leap than between like the Super Nintendo generation and then leading into PlayStation, like 3D with PlayStation Nintendo 64, or PlayStation 1 to PlayStation 2? I mean, we're kind of way past those giant leaps. And so I wonder, I'm like, okay, are they talking about crazy, like, is there AI related stuff as far as like upscaling and frame generation and stuff like that isn't that we're starting to see in PCs that is going to be coming to consoles. Is that what they're talking about?
Are they gonna launch Copilot with the console?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to say, but I'm glad at least even if we can look at a statement like that and view it as a little silly. I hope it just means that they still got that fight in them to try to push things, and like we were saying earlier, just that spirit of competition is still alive despite them releasing games outside of their platform.
Yeah, I think my only concern with them now is like I just don't see value in owning an Xbox anymore, a console. And again, that's for me. It's because they've talked about things and said things like I forgot about the cloud thing. I remember that in the Xbox One generation, and then it was wait till we free up more ESRAM. There was that. And then there was, that we eat monsters for breakfast, and then them not taking advantage of, in my opinion, the Series X really delivering those games that really spoke to the hardware of that particular console. So for me, like I've been saying this for quite some time now, Dustin, that if you want the definitive Xbox experience, go PC. I played Starfield, and I had the definitive experience of Starfield because I have a high-end PC. So, it's the AI piece that you mentioned, the upscaling technology, maybe that's what she's talking about. And if she is, that sounds interesting. But I also wonder if it's kind of this, the rumor of this kind of Nintendo Switch-like, console, this device that's going to be a convergence of handheld technology and console gaming. And maybe if that's what they're working on, and that's what she's referring to. And that would be interesting. That would be interesting if they release something like that. I don't know if that's something I would be interested in, because I really don't game on the fly. That's just not my thing. I prefer to sit on the couch in front of my TV or behind my PC monitor. That's why I prefer to game. I'm not saying that mobile gaming is wrong, because I know somebody in the comment section will say that later, but it's not my cup of tea.
Yeah, dude, it's been crazy seeing the revival of handhelds really in the last few years. I mean, arguably, a lot of people pointed to the Steam Deck and how that's been kind of changing people's viewpoints about what handheld gaming is. But I would say, honestly, it goes back to the Switch and the idea of the hybrid console. Just because the main reason in my mind that we saw a lot of problems with handheld gaming for a while is that they were their own separate games. I mean, I would say the main reason why the Vita never succeeded is that, there's many reasons, most of them being Sony, but one of them being that, if you look at development costs between making a Vita game and a PS3 game at the time, it's like, okay, well, it's going to cost a pretty comparable amount of money. You're going to be releasing on a very limited player base, and for a cheaper price as well. So it's like, well, why would you make a Vita game when you can make a PS3 game? And then Nintendo also struggling with the Wii U and the 3DS at the same time because their development was split up between two different platforms. And then they were able to really fix that with the Switch by making this combined handheld console hybrid. And so now we have the Steam Deck, which kind of plays into that same paradigm where it's like, okay, well, you have your PC, you have your Steam Deck, it shares the same library. You don't need to you can have just one or the other. And now there are rumors about Xbox looking at handhelds. There's rumors about PlayStation getting back into the game. And clearly the market is interested in this hybrid approach. And so what does that mean for the development of these games? Because there is definitely the concern about building games for a lower common denominator with a handheld. But at the same time, with things like with how scalable games are, I wonder how much of an issue that will be and what that ultimately looks like. It's kind of mind-boggling to think about. It's like, okay, we have the Steam Deck approach, and then whatever Xbox looks like, that surely will include Game Pass, and then PlayStation, who's been out of it for so long, and then possibly hopping back in. It's like it might get a little messy with all these different devices and platforms. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, no, it really is. I mean, and that's kind of like that's kind of where obviously, like, I think if for many of us who play video games, like we like new technology, so that's kind of that's what I'm interested to see, like how this all plays out in the future, and if they do this kind of hybrid console experience that gives you kind of the type of experiences on the fly that you would get sitting at home. Because you're right, like you go back to just looking at like mobile gaming, like those games were always different, right? They weren't console-like experiences. So if they can kind of converge console-like experiences with these mobile devices, and I'm speaking more so to Xbox, maybe that could be a big win for them. Maybe,
Yeah.
Where
Well,
they have a device. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and right now Sony too, like they're always interested in having multiple arms of their business, and clearly PSVR 2 was not it. There's been rumors floating around. I don't know how much validity, but they're still out there about it's like how much is PlayStation thinking about not supporting PlayStation VR 2 anymore in the main. I don't know about that. I know that there was like some developer that said that in a subreddit somewhere. So I'm not necessarily saying like I believe that, but clearly PSVR 2 has not been the success that they want it to be. And that's kind of a separate topic, but still, I could see if PSVR 2 goes away, that they'd be more open to reestablishing another arm of the business being some kind of handheld that works with the console.
Yeah. I do want to move on to, because I think I said I'd keep you an hour here. So how are you with time right now, Dustin?
Oh, I'm good. Yeah.
Okay. I do want to move on to, as we talk about the industry, let's talk about COVID, post-COVID, and what we're seeing, this conversation around consoles dying, AAA games are sustainable. I've been gaming a long time. The idea around consoles being dying or being a thing of the past has been something that's been discussed for the last 10 years plus. If you go back to 2008, Michael Pachter actually said, he actually did say, this is going to be the final generation of consoles. And I was like, really? And it was going to be mobile that takes over. That never happened. So,
right.
But the gaming industry, we obviously we've seen the layoffs. Layoffs are always an unfortunate part of business, and they have real impact to people's lives. And it's been ugly to see the amount of layoffs that we've been seeing in the industry, because so many people have been impacted by this. But I think you may have said this before or earlier on the show, or maybe before you went live, but we really came from like a high of highs or COVID. And I think you mentioned there was an influx of cash coming in during COVID, because it was like this unprecedented time where people were actually forced to stay at home and we're trying to figure out what to do. Like, what do we do with ourselves here? Not surprising. Subscription services went up, like things like Netflix. People are watching more TV. No surprise, alcohol sales went up.
Yeah.
But and then gaming. So, but here we are today, and so what are your thoughts about what's happened in the last 3.5, 4 years now since COVID with the industry?
Yeah. Well, I think it's kind of one of these situations where there's many factors playing at once that kind of led us to this situation. I mean, first of all, you mentioned that seeing these huge booms when everyone's at home playing games, and so at the same time we see this huge influx of cash being poured into the economy from COVID relief stuff, and people have all this excess income. I mean, not everybody, and that's kind of a whole nother topic when talking about COVID, but all this cash being pushed into the economy, and so we have all this crazy investment and projections about how many people are going to be playing games. We need to invest, make more games, and so now with things settling out, and it turns out that gaming didn't necessarily grow as much as those projections were showing during COVID, that a lot of those people that were in when they were stuck at home aren't necessarily in now. And so we have that whole factor in combination with the fact that it's like, man, inflation is insane, not only in the United States, but across the world. So people are tightening their belt and buying less games. At the same time, games are more expensive to create than ever. And so there's that element. And then the last one I would say too is just that the nature of games has changed so much. And I think a lot of people initially think about something like Game Pass and the economics there, but I would even say that this change started before COVID with games like Fortnite, the live service, the free to play live service games. And this is something that's important that we talk about on Sacred Symbols, is that, yeah, it's not necessarily our audience. Our audience is hardcore. You know, maybe they play some of those games, but they're still buying new releases and stuff like that. But when you step outside our gaming bubble and see what the market's playing, it's like these games are what's taking up a lot of the playtime and the mind share of the general audience, to the point where, and I know this is a small anecdotal piece, but I think it's really relevant, that when I see my little cousins and talk to them about what games they're playing, they're playing games like Fortnite and Apex Legends or Roblox or something like that. And when I was their age, it was like I was trying to check out as many games as possible, getting used stuff and playing all these different things, but their friends are playing these forever type games, and there's not really a need for them to go out and buy new releases because they're happy playing these games. And so it's funny, even thinking back to the last E3 that I was at, I remember, I think it was because I was there with with my friend Ben, who's also works at Last Stand, and he was talking to a developer. It's like their main point of competition wasn't necessarily the games that were also releasing at the same time. It was peeling people away from Fortnite and these live service games. So going back to all these different factors, you know, inflation, investing into the industry that wasn't necessarily a good thing, didn't necessarily pan out, and people's time being totally spread out all over the place, led us to the situation we're in now. And so are we at the end of consoles? I don't think so. I think that the industry, while we're seeing a lot of losers, we're still seeing a lot of people make a lot of money. They're just not necessarily making as much money as they expected. And so, yeah, it sucks that these executives made bets that at the end don't pan out and they don't pay the price. All these people they hired, all these projects they greenlit, they're the ones that end up suffering. And it sucks. But ultimately, I feel like we will the industry will normalize out. And there's going to have to be, you know, whether it's studio closings, projects being canceled, and I think it's going to start to affect games themselves. In fact, I would expect with PlayStation in particular, you see a game like Spider-Man 2 that the margins on it, yeah, it's sold extremely well, but they really didn't make as much money as they expected because the game was just so expensive to make. So what do you do in that situation? Obviously, we already saw layoffs at Insomniac and other PlayStation studios, and that's happening across the industry. But in addition, I think these games are going to start getting shorter, is going to be the main thing. And so that'll be disappointing to some people. I personally think it's okay that some of these games, like a game like God of War Ragnarok, was amazing. It was my game of the year that year. It was longer than it needed to be. It had more stuff in it than it needed to be. So seeing these games get shorter, I think, is honestly a good solution in some cases to figuring out the budget bloat, so to say.
Yeah. You know, I don't disagree that with this idea that not every game needs to be like 50, 60, 80 hours long.
Right.
Like I don't think every game does. And Sean Layden has actually talked about that quite a bit. So there was an interview he did with GameIndustry.biz where he talked about that. He talked like, look, not every game needs to be this long. You know, and the shorter the game, the less content, the less work goes into it, the less time, resources, money that you're spending. You know, the larger the game, more complex the game is, the more money you're going to spend. So I don't think we'll get away from larger games. I think, like for example, we talked about Larian earlier. Their games have always traditionally been long games. You know, I think they'll probably continue doing that until it just doesn't make financial sense for them to do it. But I think where we'll get some of those larger games, those larger experiences, well, I think those are probably going to be concentrated, I think, in my opinion, from some of the larger publishers, developers that have resources to do those types of games. Or they may say, you know what, no, we need to scale back on costs and say, we're just going to reduce the size, scale, scope of these games to reduce costs. But I don't disagree with this idea of course correction that you mentioned. And I think that's what's happening here with the industry. And I think people forget that this industry is like any other consumer industry, or any other industry that experiences explosive growth. That, in my opinion, Dustin, I don't think that growth was sustainable. I think you just mentioned they over projected, and maybe they thought it was going to be sustainable. And some of those people, some of those people who left after COVID, they're not coming back. They're just not coming back.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, is that, again, this comes from the looking outside our bubble situation, where we love games so much that it's hard to imagine people leaving them behind. But it was a very unique situation that we were all in 2020. And so for some people stuck at home that normally wouldn't play games, it's it sounds like a fun option. But when we're not under the constraints that we were in 2020, that games don't look as appealing as to some of the other hobbies that they weren't able to really do at the time.
Yeah, people are going out and, for lack of a better word, touching grass.
Right.
They're going out, hanging out with their friends. I mean, that's what I'm saying. This is the argument I always have with when people are saying, "Oh, well, the console market is not growing." Well, yeah, it's not growing. It's a mature market. But that's because there's only a finite group of people that you can sell a console to. And a lot of people make the argument, "Oh, well, there's mobile. There's cloud gaming." Again, there's only a finite group of people that are going to play games on mobile and console. And actually, it's interesting. I looked up mobile, because mobile is one of those things everyone's like, "Oh, there's they can go mobile. They'll grow their business by going mobile." And so I started doing a little digging, and what I found is that mobile's kind of hit that point of maturation where it's a mature market now. Actually, Morgan Stanley had a great article or analysis on the mobile market, and it's funny because they said in the U.S., or in the biggest mobile markets, China, the U.S. U.S. is actually not the biggest mobile gaming market. It's like China, Korea, the Asian markets, and they said that market had matured, and ways that developers were going to, or publishers were going to, grow their business in mobile was to make better games and to make new ways, new revenue way, or create new ways to generate additional revenue off mobile gamers. And that's kind of what we see in the console space today. And I also think, Dustin, there's, what was it? It was Dragon's Dogma. And I think you may have probably seen a lot of the pushback about some of those quality of life type things that were paywalled.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm wondering if we're going to see more of that.
Yeah.
And I know Ibarra, and this sounds crazy. I don't think this is going to happen. But imagine a world with developers hey, if you really like our game, hey, here's our PayPal.
Yeah.
Those, I could see that. It sounds crazy, and it makes me kind of cringe a bit, clutch my fist, thinking of something like that. But those are things that developers or publishers may try to help generate additional revenue from a finite consumer group, or in this case, a console market that's very mature. That's probably not going to see much more growth in terms of hardware sales.
Right. And I mean, dude, one of the main things that I really picked up on when Hogwarts Legacy came out is that the early access is, and one of the easiest cost-free ways in order to generate additional revenue for the game, by simply, you don't even have to necessarily do anything. I mean, a lot of times the early access comes with other bonus stuff and stuff like that, some skins or whatever, a bonus mission, but it is surprising how many people, and they've gotten me this way. It's hey, if you spend an extra $20-30. We'll throw you a couple bonuses and you get to play early. Like that's compelling, and I wouldn't be surprised. We're already seeing it more and more. The problem though is we see like the Star Wars Outlaws, where it's like, okay, you're getting a little egregious here, where it's like, oh, 3-day early access. That's not necessarily something like for the amount of money. I'm trying to remember how much more it was, but it's like, okay, maybe not so much on that, but the idea, it's like, hey, if you buy the special edition, you get early access. That's pretty interesting. And the other thing too is just about games is that it's really, really tough. I mentioned, inflation, people's money is not going as far as it did just a few years ago. And so games are $70 a pop new now, and the unfortunate thing, we get so many negative comments about this on Sacred, but it's not going to stop us from saying the truth. It's like gaming $70 now. Go look at a KB Toys catalog or a Toys R Us catalog of how much Super Nintendo games cost then, and account for inflation. So games are cheaper now than they were then in a lot of cases. And yeah, there's an argument about, personal spending income going down and how that relates to it. But, games are also, as we were talking about, more expensive to make than ever. Now, there's so many more elements that go into a game, whether it's, the race towards photorealism, which whether or not you like that is totally subjective. The having fully voice acting, all these different features, things like that. These are all things that just add up and cost a lot of money. And this comes to at a time where developers are in demand. And that's one of the things about Insomniac too, about Spider-Man not making a huge profit, is that Insomniac really cares about hiring people, paying them very well, and keeping the best talent. It's like, well, that's going to come at a cost. Again, once I keep saying inflation, at a time where hiring these developers is going to cost way more than it did before.
Yeah. Well, actually, did you mention that games were cheaper? Like, I think you mentioned like the KB advertisement, KB stores. Yeah,
like KB Toys or Toys R Us, stuff like that. Like you can look and there's Super Nintendo games that are $100 in 1994.
Yeah, yeah, and actually, if you do the math backwards, and GameIndustry.biz had a great article on this a couple years ago on, is gaming really more expensive today? I understand the relative number, of 60 being like 70 is more than $60, and that's typically how consumers look at things, right? Like, wait a minute, I paid $60. They're not adjusting for inflation in their head or the value of the dollar. No one does that. No one does. Like, I don't know any consumer. Maybe there are some consumers that do that, but they had a great article about that. And they talked about like how a $50 game in 1993 or 1994 is equivalent to, actually, let me do the math here real quick. It's equivalent to like $120 today.
Yeah, there's a nice government website. I think it's a .gov. So we can put in $50 in January. We'll just say January. The website's not working. So, but yeah, I think I'll see if I can get this working. But you're right though, that the inflation. I mean, just even look at inflation the last few years post COVID. But now add that with other games or other factors as well. That's just like, man, okay, so this calculator, $50 in January 1993 to today is $131. Today's money for 50, or I put $60 in January 1993 compared to March 2024, $131.
Yeah. I put in $50 in 1994 is worth $105 today. But I even did this, like $70 at the start of this generation. This console generation is equivalent to paying $80 today for a video game. And I always look at that number, and then to your point, like this is what really, I think we talked about this earlier, where they where there's people don't think about the nuance or kind of dive deep into the costs associated with making video games. So if you look at the fact that games that were $70 in 2020 are now equivalent to paying $80 today, you also have to factor in that the cost, and you mentioned this too, to hire people has gone up, especially software developers and engineers. That's a highly desirable skill set. There's not a lot of people that do that here. I think this is, and this is just my opinion, but I think this is one of the reasons why Sony started the Hero Project and trying to partner with studios in India and in China. I know they're making inroads in Africa as well, because the labor cost to make games is cheaper there compared to here in the U.S.
Right.
And so like the math has to math at some point. And when we had Colin on back September, and I mentioned him, like, I think one of the questions I asked Colin was, how do what are your thoughts about this idea that we should, as consumers, that we should have AAA games given to us on the cheap? And he says something to the fact that, like, people need to speak with their money, with their wallets.
Right.
And yeah, go ahead.
Oh, good. Oh, no. I don't want to interrupt you.
And so, like, I don't disagree with that. And so, like, two things are going to have to, like, happen. Like, either they're going to figure out ways to monetize us more to keep that cost down, or they're going to increase the price of games. And I do think they're going to increase the price of games again. I wouldn't surprise, like, in my opinion, it wouldn't surprise me if we saw $80 games in next generation.
Oh, I would lock that in. The next generation, $80 for sure.
Yeah. And I think, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and the other thing too that I think is important, and another thing that we get a lot of pushback on, is that people talk about how unaffordable gaming is, but that's only from the mindset of you needing to buy new releases on launch day too. Like when I was a kid, gaming was unaffordable if I was asking my parents to buy me new release games all the time. Like, I remember the first time I got a new release game for Christmas, and it was like, it blew my mind that we were able to even do that. So I guess what I'm saying is, it's like, gaming, it is expensive. I'm not trying to downplay that, but it doesn't have to be as expensive as a lot of our mindsets are. As far as, like, there's a great PlayStation Store sale going on right now. The used game market, maybe as far as physical, is dwindling, but there are plenty of deals to be had. And it sucks to not play the latest releases, and especially if you're really into it. But it's not that gaming is completely inaccessible at a lower price.
Oh, actually, it's even more accessible than, like, when you and I were growing up. And that's the part. I feel like that's not celebrated enough. The fact that we have free-to-play games. You mentioned Fortnite. Like, very, very low bar of entry there with Fortnite. Where they make their money is on the skins and all the other stuff, the microtransactions. But there's also AA games. Like, one of the things that I saw on Twitter, Dustin, I know Twitter's probably not the best example here, giving some of the conversations that go on there. But one of the things that I was reading around whether AAA games are sustainable, and people are like, that we need more AA games. But the problem is, if you look at, like, Circana, used to be formerly known as MPD, if you look at their sales charts, like, the top 10 games are usually AAA games. Mm-hmm. So, like, it doesn't make, like AA games aren't the solution if people aren't buying them.
Right. Yeah, it's the AA game thing too. This is something Colin really champions, about the idea of there just being too many games, and
I don't
that
disagree.
there's so many of these games that it's like, who's the audience for this? And I've made the argument that smaller games that have an appropriate budget for their projected audience in mind, I'm cool with that. But at the same time, it's like, man, there's so many of these games, the budget is so expensive, and it's like, this isn't necessarily going to work out.
Yeah, that's a great point, by the way. Like, we've talked about this on BRAP quite a bit, where we have asked the question, are there just too many games now? Like, if you look at the Steam store, Game Logic, actually, who's a co-host on the show, he pulled some numbers on, like, the amount of games that were released on Steam. There were, like, thousands of games I've never even heard of. And that's the thing. Like, if that's, so we talked about not having enough suppliers in the market. You can have too many suppliers in the market too. Mm-hmm. And fighting for, again, a finite group of consumers, that's an uphill battle, in my opinion. And how do you get the attention of those consumers?
Yeah. And that's what I'm saying. It's like, it's almost like if you want to do a smaller game, you need to really focus in on your niche and what's the game about, just because so many games, if these games that are trying to be more broadly appealing, it's like they're busy playing other stuff, and your smaller game isn't going to stand out to them. And that's why, and it introduces other problems too, such as discoverability, where you go to the PlayStation Store and you go to the new, click and sort by new, and see just the constant flow of games. It's like, man, some of these might be really good. Most of them probably aren't, and they're all bunched together. And so these good games are just they're just lost because the flood of all these games.
It's overwhelming for me at times to look at the storefront. What do I play next? And there's just so much. There's so many games out there, and only so much time in the day, and so. But I think these are issues that the industry will, I think, figure out. Hopefully, figure out, because I think what could potentially happen too is more studio closures. With some of these games that maybe don't have a window or a way to get the attention of consumers when they're up against a slate of so many different types of games. And one of the things that's kind of interesting too, that again, another game industry dot, in case anyone listening doesn't already know, I do read, I get a lot of my news and read a lot of the articles, GameIndustry.biz. There was a speaker, and I forget her name, at GDC. She talked about the funding in the gaming industry and the challenges there, that even with like VC or even publishers, like they want a certain type of game that they believe is going to sell. And they're looking at those numbers. They're looking at the data, and if your game doesn't fit that mold, you may not get funding. Yeah. So I only bring that up because I think it just speaks again to the complexities of game development in the industry that I think people sometimes don't think about. So
yeah, it's changing, rapidly, and it's really, I'm interested to see where it shakes out, because it's like, it's one of these things where I do want these smaller, games or whatever that push boundaries to be able to have the chance to be seen. But at the same time, it's like, if only certain, these big games are the ones that's selling, it's like, well, we also got to make sure we reward and highlight these smaller games that are doing new things. This touches back to way earlier in the conversation about, the past generations, thinking about 360 and PS3, and how we were still kind of in a time where genres were being formed, I guess, in a way, or evolved. Thinking about like Halo, there were first-person shooters before that, but we were able to actively see the evolution of the FPS genre, and things have kind of gotten stale now with that, and we're seeing that elsewhere too. People endlessly complain about PS5 releasing or PlayStation releasing the same type of game over and over, and I think there is truth to that. And so you want to make sure you have a market where people can try new things, and we're not just constantly making the same type of game because that's what's sold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for me as a gamer, that's what concerns me a bit. Especially after reading that article, like I want to see creativity. Look, and at the same time, I understand that this is a business, and businesses are in the business to make money. But I do want to see that creativity, and that's why I always implore people: if you're saying $70 games are too expensive, or that AA games are the solution, or indie games are the solution, please, support those games, buy them. That's the best thing that you can do as a consumer. So support those developers, buy those games, support those AA titles, those indie titles.
Right. Yeah, it's been something that I've felt, I don't know if guilty is the right word, but being on Sacred Symbols, it's so easy especially with how many big new releases are, to just go from one thing to the next, only focus on big releases, because that's a lot of times what the audience wants to hear about. But I do feel like this small level of responsibility that I should be going out and checking out some of these smaller games in order to highlight them and it's been great. Balatro didn't need my help at all. Clearly, that game sold millions on its own. But it's been cool seeing, like, talking about that game and getting into some smaller games, and then being able to see the audience interact, be like, hey, I'm glad you mentioned this or talked about this game. I would have never checked it out if you hadn't done that. And so, yeah, making sure to take the time, checking out these smaller games, and giving them their due as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. One more question for you, Dustin, before we wrap up here. Do you think consoles are going to go away?
No.
That's kind of been a conversation point as we think about what generation is the kids? My kids now, is it Gen Z? I think it's Gen Z. Yeah.
I don't know, because I think there is the generation after Gen Z now. I get so confused with the different
me too. Yeah.
parameters of that, but yeah, are consoles going away? I wouldn't say anytime soon, in my opinion. I mean, there's still all of us people around our age, and I wonder too, this is purely like, I have no idea what the answer to this is, that with a younger generation growing up and being more interested in live service or mobile games or something like that, is that as they get older, do they eventually look for something more with more substance and start to become more interested?
It's a great point.
I don't know if that's the case. I hope it's the case, and it's something I think about too. Having my own kid in the next few months here, is that it's like, okay, it sounds silly, but it's like, okay, how do I introduce games to him? And how do I, obviously anytime someone has a kid, they want them to like the things you like and stuff like that. I don't want to be the guy the dad that's like, you need to like what I like and stuff like that. But it's important to me that when they play games, it's like, yeah, there is these live service games, but growing up and checking out multiple games, checking out different things, seeing what all the industry has to offer and stuff like that, just because a lot of kids out there, like I was saying, they kind of just like these things with their friends. They don't really stray outside of it. And it's like, man, there's so much out there for you to enjoy.
Yeah. So the generation after Z is Gen Alpha.
That's right.
Yeah, I just looked that up. And so that's anyone born between 2010 and 2024. Yeah. So, it's kind of interesting. Like you brought up a great point, and one that we've talked about here on the show is, are they going to hit a point as they get older where they're going to want games that have a bit more substance to it? Games that are like, I don't hate to use the word movies, but that's how people sometimes criticize Sony experiences. But games would like have more emotional impact, much the way they would get from like a TV show or a movie or something like that. And also, like I wonder too, like as they get disposable income, are they going to seek those kinds of experiences? So I at least in my opinion, I think that the consoles we know it may change in its form factor, as maybe internet broadband infrastructure improves and the cloud, the ability for cloud to deliver like one-to-one experiences improve. Maybe that happens, or maybe there's a future where there's an app.
Right.
But I don't know in the near term if those things are going to go, or if the consoles are going to go away. But I see my kids who are part of Gen Alpha, and to your point, Dustin, they do gravitate, at least my 10-year-old does, towards games that have a social element to it. And that game is Fortnite, where he's playing with all his school friends. Like they literally get home from school and they're like, they just saw each other and now they're playing Fortnite.
Right. Yeah.
But also, like my son's playing what I allow him to play. He's got access to a PlayStation console. He's got access to a PC. He's got access to a Nintendo Switch. Some kids don't have that. They only have access to a Nintendo Switch, or like a mobile handheld type of device where they're playing games. So I think that like part of what they're playing is based on what their parents can give them or allow them to play. And to your point, like I'm interested to see how that evolution pans out as they get older, as maybe their tastes change, as they get more disposable income, because like you said, gaming is an expensive hobby. So it's gonna be interesting to see how those things play out. And I think the obvious here is if the demand for consoles declines, and we see a rise in demand for mobile type gaming or more like Fortnite type gaming, then yeah, those experiences that we have, or those what I call traditional console experience, may go away. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out with this generation, Gen Z and
absolutely.
Gen Alpha,
Yeah, that's going to be when I'm, it's obviously there are many more important things about raising a human being.
Yeah, exactly.
But I got to be honest, it's one of the things that I'm the most interested in is like, like I said, how do I introduce games? I'm not going to be one of those guys like you're going to start with the NES and work your way up. So I'm not going to be like that. But, making sure there's some traditional training, we'll say, in there is important to me.
Yeah, I don't disagree. Yeah, my children, their first experience of gaming was on a Fire tablet. Playing the like the Angry Birds type games. Those games where there's a lot of swiping, back and forth, and but now they've moved on to console gaming, and my oldest actually games on PC.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Both I mentioned Sega Genesis, but man, PC was huge for me when I was a little kid playing.
Me too.
Playing. I'm trying to think. Like, I always mention like some of the like early childhood games. Like there's Toonland with Howie Mandel. It was one of these like obscure games I played when I was like I could barely even sit up at a computer. But then like early Flash games and stuff like that. But yeah, PC. It's good. I think it's good for kids to be into PC gaming too. It teaches them more than just necessarily playing games, but how to use a computer.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, Dustin, I want to thank you for your time again, and let's not wait 3 years to have you back on, sir. We'd love to get you back on again sooner than later. And this conversation could go on much longer, but I do have a hard stop now. But I really do appreciate your time. I know you're busy, so thank you again for joining us. If you want to be found on social media, please let everyone know where they can find you, and plug the work that you're doing at Last Stand Media again.
Sure, yeah. So basically on all platforms, I'm at Dustin Can Fly, whether on Twitter or Instagram or whatever, and pretty much all my work is on Last Stand Media. So and particularly Sacred Symbols on YouTube, you can search and find that. Where everything is through Patreon as well, patreon.com/laststandmedia. And that's about it, I think. Thanks again for having me. Yeah, it's a great conversation. Thanks for having me back. And yeah, let's not wait for another 3 years.
Yeah, or another pandemic, God forbid.
Right. Yeah.
No, thank you again, Dustin. I really appreciate it. And please, if you haven't done so, check out Last Stand Media, Sacred Symbols, Punching Up, Defining Duke. Great content. Great chemistry, as I said earlier, with the different shows and the panel members. It's always a great conversation there around all things video games. So please check them out. And we will be back tonight. I know this sounds crazy, but we'll be back tonight for our regularly scheduled 9 p.m. show. And please come out, hang out with us again. We're going to discuss the Stellar Blade reviews. We have some other other topics we're going to discuss as well. One of them being Embracer Group, which I was going to get to today, Dustin. I just ran out of time, but we're going to discuss that as well on tonight's show. So until then, we'll catch you next time. Dustin, thank you again. Everyone in the live chat, thank you so much for hanging out with us. Please join us again tonight at 9 p.m. If you haven't done so, hit that like button, subscribe, hit the bell notification so you are alerted when we go live. The Great Beat Rich says more BRAP. Yes, more BRAP tonight at 9 p.m. Thank you again, everyone, for watching. We'll see you then.